to In the Margins. Today, I'm pleased to have as my guest Dr. Brian Williams, a renowned trauma surgeon and author of a new book titled The Bodies Keep Coming: Dispatches from a Black Trauma Surgeon on Racism, Violence, and How We Heal. Dr. Williams, welcome. So glad that you have agreed to join us here on In the Margins. And I just wanted to start out with this question before we get into some of the topics you tackled in your book. I was wondering if you could just talk about your educational background. Your educational background is so varied. You had so many different experiences. And I was wondering if you could talk about your journey through education and higher education and how the different stops on that journey might have informed some of the work that you do today.
Absolutely. And first, thank you for having me on your show, David. It's a honor to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. As far as my educational journey, I'm a first generation college graduate. I earned an appointment to the United States Air Force Academy, where I majored in aeronautical engineer. So my undergrad years were at a service academy, and I think that comes with a certain amount of military training, academic excellence, physical rigors, but also this molding of individuals who are meant to go out and serve their communities and the country. I had no plans to become a doctor at that time. Like I said, I was an aeronautical engineer, went on active duty, and did my work as an Air Force officer. It was later that I had this desire to go into medicine, and I transitioned. I went to medical school at the University of South Florida down in Tampa and had a traditional 4-year medical education with 2 years in the classroom and 2 years of clinical rotations. I decided I wanted to become a trauma surgeon. I knew that as a medical student, I wanted to become a trauma surgeon. So the next step on my journey was to go to residency, which I did at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is one of Harvard's main teaching hospitals. Did my general surgery residency there. Then I wanted to focus on trauma surgery, which required more training after that, right? So I went down to Atlanta to do my fellowship in trauma and surgical critical care at Grady Hospital, which is affiliated with Emory University Medical School. And that's where I focused on becoming a trauma surgeon and critical care specialist. And after that, I was done. Medical school, residency, fellowship, and I moved to Dallas, Texas to begin my career as an attending trauma surgeon at Parkland Hospital as a faculty member at UT Southwestern Medical School.
And I was wondering about trauma surgery in particular. Of course, in your book, you talk about the life of a trauma surgeon and in such detail and the number of things that you see. It's almost like a battlefield in terms of looking at some of the injuries that you actually treat. I was just wondering why trauma surgery? What about that particular branch of medicine appealed to you?
Yeah, I say this frequently. I didn't choose trauma surgery. Trauma surgery chose me. And this would happen one of my first nights on call as a medical student at Tampa General Hospital. And this gunshot victim came in, and the team they went to work all out to save this patient. And I was just enthralled by what appeared to be chaos in the trauma bay, but really is an organized movement of different individuals to do their jobs to save this patient. So that adrenaline rush really pulled me in. I'm someone who likes to be pulled in different directions, but also the fact that they were doing everything they can to save this patient's life. And that really grabbed me. And I knew right then, so I want to be a trauma surgeon. Over the course of my career, there is that technical aspect of doing the big cases, working in the trauma bay, but it's the humanistic side of trauma surgery, which is very gratifying as well. Knowing that on some of the worst days of people's lives, we are there to save their lives and comfort their families, because none of us is probably prepared to wake up one day and we or someone we care about suffers a life-threatening injury, whether that be from gunshot wounds, as I dealt with most of my career, but car accidents, workplace accidents, and what that can mean to your life and your family's lives. But as trauma surgeons, we get to be there for these families. And that is something I find very gratifying, is to be someone that can hold strangers' hands and say, look, it's rough right now, but we're going to do everything we can to take care of you with our patients and our families. And you can make a difference in the lives of strangers that can reverberate for the rest of their lives.
Your perspective as a Black male, of course, is unique. I think about your time in Chicago, working, of course, there, and we know the devastating impact of violence, of gun violence, in Black and Brown communities in Chicago. I think you talk about mere blocks from one of the nation's premier medical centers. It's a catastrophe in terms of what's happening in terms of gun violence. One of my questions for you is, as a Black male in particular, I think of even myself, every time, I see, police or in certain circumstances, I think about, all of the Black men in particular, who have a relationship with the justice system and law enforcement, which is just consistently traumatizing. How did you approach keeping your own emotions in check when it was time to do business and save lives, given what and we know about gun violence and how Black and Brown communities are particularly affected when it comes to this particular epidemic, and the epidemic, of course, of police brutality?
That was something I was really intentional about in the book, was using my experience as a trauma surgeon and a Black doctor and Black man in society to jump off to address these bigger issues that we're dealing with in America right now: gun violence, police brutality, healthcare crisis, and more. So for me, taking care, and it's not just Chicago, right? Taking care of gun violence victims in Tampa and Boston and Atlanta and Dallas and Chicago, a recurring theme was the disparities in victims I saw who were from Black and Brown communities. And the majority of those victims for me were your young Black men. So that changes me, right? That changed me. I saw myself in them. I can see their families and my families when I'm talking to their families about the injuries and deaths of people they care about. And I felt that there was more I needed to do to address this epidemic of gun violence. I knew the work I was doing in the hospital was necessary and important and noble. And for many of the victims, when they wake up and saw me as a Black doctor who had cared for them, that was sometimes more meaningful than the fact that they were alive, right? They would say, like, you're the first Black doctor I've ever had. Same with their parents. So that shows the power of just the necessity of having diverse representation within medicine, but also with motivation for me to continue to do the work I did with excellence. But how to transform populations and systems to end that sort of carnage? Because in the places where I've chosen to work, most of my patients were Black and Brown young men. And just think about it today, within 24 hours of this podcast, half of the firearm homicides will be young Black men. The question is, why is that, and what can we do about it? We kind of accept that as a norm, but we do not have to, right? We need to do something about that at a systemic level. And for me as a trauma surgeon, there's a limit of what I can do in the hospital. So in the book, I'm describing all this and trying to open the eyes of people who may not be, they're not in this world, right? I want to draw you in to this world with stories and personal observations, but say, okay, here's what the reality of this, what are we going to do now? And hopefully you as a reader are inspired to do something differently after you've read the book. It's a call to action.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public policy work that you have done, because of course, in your capacity as a trauma surgeon, the bodies kept coming, right? You're just doing your best to save black man after black man, and it in itself it might have seemed as if this will never end. You do talk about solutions, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public policy work that you did, and the work that you're doing now to actually stop this epidemic, or at least turn the tide when it comes to so many black men being killed.
Yeah, the book is meant to be hopeful and a roadmap towards healing, and it was imperative for me to describe what I'm doing as an individual to be part of the solution. And what you mentioned there is extremely important, is how policy influences our day-to-day lives. And I specifically talk about the epidemic of gun violence in many racially segregated communities in this country. Now we got to take a step back and look at our history, understand how policy has led to these segregated communities, which now have higher levels of endemic violence, particularly gun violence. So that means requires policies, intentional policies, to reverse that trend. And the work I did, I served as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellow, and served in Washington full time as an advisor. And one of the big things I had a chance to do was work for Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, whom, if you don't know who he is, he's the leading voice in Congress for gun safety, that bore out of what happened at Newtown, Connecticut, about 11 years ago. We passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year in the wake of the Uvalde mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, at that elementary school. To be a trauma surgeon that learned how to pass federal policy that will save thousands of lives per year, that is an extension and a continuation of all the work I've done on the front lines of gun violence. Everything I've learned studying solutions, and now being able to apply it in the policy realm brings it all full circle. That should come back and help uplift communities. And I'll just focus on one part of that bill, which was the most significant gun safety legislation in a generation, is the funding for community violence intervention programs, which essentially will provide funding for those that are in the community, those that are closest to the problem and probably have great solutions to end the violence, so they continue to do the work to save lives, right? And this is something we learn by being proximal to the violence and those that are suffering. So that is an example of something I've done and continue to do to ensure that we can reduce, so we can save lives due to gun violence.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Just looking at your career trajectory. Obviously, on the front lines in healthcare, but of course, as you mentioned, of late, your passion appears to be solving the problem, right? Instead of just continuing to patch up, gun-ridden bodies and continue to save lives. I was wondering if you talk about your career now, right? What are your passions currently? Talk about the important work you did on the Hill, which hopefully will help to turn this tide. I was wondering if you could talk about where you are career-wise and how that particular experience will inform your future in terms of your next steps career-wise.
Well, currently I am running for Congress.
Amen.
I'm a candidate for Congress in 32nd Congressional District of Texas. If elected, I will be the first trauma surgeon elected to Congress. I'll also be the first Black doctor with voting privileges in Congress. This is the perfect time, I feel, and I'm compelled to do this because the country is in a crisis, not just of gun violence, but of healthcare affordability and accessibility, our attacks on our democracy. I'm a veteran, as you mentioned before, so serving the country is something near and dear to me. But everything you and I have talked about so far, they form my experience and expertise about being compelled to run. Now, understand, this is driven not by ambition. This is a very purpose-driven decision to serve in Congress because I've seen what is possible. I've been part of Washington fighting for these things we talk about as far as saving lives. and recognize that as a doctor in Congress, as a trauma surgeon in Congress, to be able to speak for those that do not have a voice in these issues and be able to submit a bill and fight for these issues at the federal level can be a way to impact the lives of millions of people per year. So currently, the campaign is going very well. I am the front runner in this race as of right now. Uh, Team is strong and solid. They're also focused and experienced. And if things go well, I will be the next Congress representative of Congress for District 32 in Texas. And I also want to invite your listeners, if they want to learn more, to visit our campaign website, drbrianwilliamsforcongress.com, and join our team.
And it's so interesting, stepping, of course, into that political realm. You've talked, of course, we talk in the book about the epidemic of gun violence. But I think about also some other things like I would not say the impact of COVID, but what COVID revealed about the healthcare disparities that we see in Black and Brown communities, how the death rates when something like COVID hit very, very disproportionately adverse when it came to Black and Brown communities. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the wider implications of your work when it comes to tackling these pervasive healthcare disparities that you mentioned.
I really appreciate that observation, David, because what you're describing there is not by accident, right? We saw these disparities, racial disparities in infections and deaths during COVID. Black people 3 times the rate of white people when it came to infections and deaths. And this is a prime example of the systems, the structures that were in place that put certain groups of people at a disadvantage. So we jump off from gun violence, right? We're talking about gun violence a lot because that is my specialty, but also we broaden that to talk about healthcare injustice, and then take this even further and talk about how we can be part of the healing of the nation by addressing all these issues from a structural standpoint. And let's take an example. When people talk about redlining, we understand redlining, that this was, federal government designating certain neighborhoods, majority Black neighborhoods, as not worthy of an investment. On the realtors maps, they put a red line around certain neighborhoods or majority Black, which that signaled to folks that, look, if you are a bank, you do not invest in the houses there. You do not provide home loans for people there. That contributed to white flight. And therefore, certain communities, housing values depressed, the economic disparities increased. And think about what that means as far as education, health, housing. And we know that low-income areas have higher levels of violence. So what do we do to address that, right? We need to reinvest in these communities. We need to radically reinvest in these communities. It's not just about removing the structures. It's about how to reinvest and uplift entire populations who have been dispossessed and ignored for generations. That is transgenerational work, right? It doesn't happen overnight. We need to be invested for the long term. If there's a saying that if the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, then we need to plant our tree to create justice in these communities. We need to do that work now. And that is part of the work I intend to do when I go to Congress, is to speak on behalf of these communities and do the work we can to uplift everyone so that everyone can thrive.
I wonder if you talk about the pivot point in your own career when you decided to write this book. I assume, of course, it was a long time coming, given the devastation that you've seen all across the country. I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the pivot point when you decided that you wanted to do more than patch up so many gun-ridden bodies. So I want to talk about the journey to writing the book in particular.
Yeah, I never set out to be an author either. I didn't plan to become a doctor in the first place, and certainly did not plan to become an author either. But in 2016, in January, part of my New Year's resolutions, changes. I want to try something new. So I began to keep a journal, which was at the time nothing fancy. Sometimes just one line a day where I would say, "Oh, hey, today I went to my daughter to get ice cream." So I got into this habit of just journaling every day. But it became very important later that year because in July of 2016 is when we had the mass shooting of police officers here in Dallas. And I was on call at the hospital. I was working that night when seven of those officers came to our hospital, and three of them were critically wounded and died from their injuries. And the team worked heroically to try to save these lives, but we couldn't. And afterwards, I did something I've done many times, which is walk into a room, deliver this devastating news to the parents, and then afterwards, I found a quiet corner of the hospital and I fell to the floor, David, and I was crying, just convulsively crying. And I don't cry. I'm not someone who cries. I hadn't done it in decades before, but there I was. But that was a moment where something was changing. I don't know if you've had that moment where something happens in your life. You really begin to question what it is you're doing. Should you be doing more? And that was when the cracks began to appear for me. And but the thing is, in the aftermath of that shooting, I felt completely alone. I could not relate to anybody. I felt there's nobody I could talk to. But I don't think anybody knew that because if you've been through these traumatic events, we can still go to work. We can compartmentalize and go to work every day, and nobody would ever know. So I was really good at doing that. But the journal became a place where I could continue to put down my thoughts. So that writing habit was already there. And I was writing what I was feeling and going through and what this all meant to me and how I wanted to do more, which then brings us to the book. Years later, I had all these words. I put them together and I said, maybe I turn this into a book. But this happened because of the therapy I was in at the time. My therapist gave me an assignment to write a trauma narrative about the event, something I'd been avoiding for a long time. But I had to go back to that night and go through this in detail. And from that, combined with my journal, this book came together. And the last step of that was I wanted it to be something that could inspire people to action. So it'd be more than just a diary of events and how I felt, but what can you take from my experience? Because in the end, the book is not about me. I'm giving you a window into this world, and I'm the character you're following around through this world. But in the end, it's about what can we do, each of us do, to help create justice. And I wanted to use that as a means of giving folks permission and inspiration to go out and do the hard work to create justice here on Earth right now.
That mass shooting in Dallas, running point on the healthcare team that responded, obviously was a pivotal point for you in wanting to do more. Obviously, by that time, you had seen a lot in your career, a lot of devastation, a lot of trauma. But I was wondering if you talk a little bit about why that particular experience was so emotionally impactful for you. This experience responding to that mass shooting as a trauma surgeon.
That's the exact same question my therapist asked me, why the shooting was different from all the others, because I'd seen so much death due to gun violence over decades. I felt like a particular failure after this particular event. I felt I'd failed those officers. I felt that I failed their families. And I recognize that may not make sense in the context of what I've done for my career, but that is how I felt. And take people back to that time. This was the summer of 2016. This is the election period between Clinton and Trump. So you have all that going on. The shooting happened the day after Philando Castile was shot and killed in the front seat of his car after being pulled over by the police. And his girlfriend was in the passenger seat and live streamed his death on Facebook. Her daughter was in the back seat, saw this happen. The day before, Alton Sterling was shot and killed at point blank range in Baton Rouge by police. So we had these protests happening around the country on July 7th. about the continued deaths of Black men at the hands of police. And it wasn't just that. A month prior, we had the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. So just think that year there was a lot of violence and animus happening within the country. And I was thinking about all this and like what was my place in all of that. And after the shooting, I had to reckon with like how I identified as a doctor, as a trauma surgeon, as a father, husband, friend, Black man, and was I doing the work I needed to do to be part of healing in this community and in the country. And I just realized, like, look, I felt I had to do more. I didn't, at the time, I didn't know what that was, but I felt I was not living the life using my experience to its best advantage to affect the people around me. Because no matter what I did, more bodies would continue to come to the hospital. Uh, I didn't articulate many ideas until 4 days after the shooting, when there was a press conference. Um, when I was initially asked to attend, I said no, I didn't want to go, but my wife was the one that pushed me. She said, like, you need to get over yourself. You have to be there, right? The country needs to see that there is a Black doctor trying to save these police officers, because the narrative during that time was, Black Lives Matter and all lives matter and blue lives matter. And there was just a lot of negative rhetoric happening in the media. And I had checked out. I wasn't watching television, listening to the news. I was just in my own little world. And she said, you need to get over yourself, get to that press conference just so you can be seen. I had no plan to talk, but eventually I did speak, talked about what this meant to me. And then from that point on, my life had changed. My professional and personal life changed because that 2 minutes became a viral event that I still hear about to this day.
My last question is with regards to the healing journey, the path towards healing that you address in this book, and of course, presumably in Congress, should you be elected, this journey towards healing, because, for of course, many in the Black and Brown community, the issues that you have tackled in the book with regards to, gun violence are intractable, right? Many of us cannot see how we get out of this, cannot see how we heal from the trauma of this continued violence. I was wondering if you could talk about that journey toward healing. What needs to happen from your perspective, and how will you continue that work to get us not from a place of continued trauma and devastation? How you continue that work towards getting to a place of healing, and how can that be accomplished?
This is really important, David, because we all have a role. And I know we're talking about my journey today, but each of us has impact on people every day, and we may never know about it. So for me, there was the individual healing that had to happen first. And moving on from that, how do we heal at a community level and a national level? And in regards to gun violence, we have a majority of Americans that want to do something to reduce needless death and suffering due to firearms. Right? We could talk about the policies that we can do and the things I want to champion in Congress, because I'm going there with the experience of a trauma surgeon who has dealt on the front lines with the carnage from gun violence, what that means to individuals, the devastation to bodies, and to families, but also as a veteran who is trained on these weapons, and as someone who has lost family members to gun violence as well. But if you look at what happened last year with the gun safety bill that was passed, there is hope, right? And that's a bill that did a lot and there's more to be done. And there are many policy initiatives that most Americans agree on. Universal background checks, raising the minimum age to purchase weapons, reinstating the assault weapons ban. Nothing is out of left field. Things we've done before, as far as the assault weapons ban, raising the age, seems most people agree on that. So from a policy perspective, we need members in Congress who can champion that, and we'll fight for that every day to keep our children and communities safe. So it is my intent to be part of the growing majority in Congress that want to do work in that area. And this election for me, this could be an historic election to get a trauma surgeon who's actually trained on these weapons, lost family members, and worked on monumental federal policy that has transformed how we address gun safety in this country. We need all these voices at the table, and I want to be a unique voice to help push for safety in our communities and for our children.
Well, Dr. Williams, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us here on In the Margins. Your work is so consequential, and I just thank you for taking some time out to share some of your life story with our audience. Thanks so much.
Dave, it's been a pleasure, tremendous honor to be on the show. And I'll also want to send a free signed copy to one of your listeners. I'll let you determine how you decide who gets that, but let me know after the show and we'll get that worked out. And I'd like to gift that to someone that listens to the show.
That'd be fantastic. Fantastic. Dr. Williams, thanks again. Much appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, David. Have a great day.